Thank you so much, Stav Shafir. Stav is joining us from Tel Aviv. Let me quickly try to do you justice, Stav, in introducing you. You first came to, you served in the army, you were a journalist, you studied sociology in a program in London that was intended for people who were trying to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Then in 2011, was that the year of the protests? Was it 2011? There was a huge upsurge of social justice protests in Israel, which you became a leader of. It was a huge, hundreds of thousands of people pitching tents on roads all over the country and saying they're just not going to take these high rents anymore and such. You went into the public consciousness that way. You became a real noted leader then. Then in 2013, and I think you and I met, I believe, in 2012, before you were in the Knesset, as I recall. Then you were elected to the Knesset in 2013 as the youngest member ever when you were 27. Then you served until earlier this year, 7 years, or six years. Was it 6 or 7 years? 7 years. And
it was like 200, but
seemed like 200. Well, okay. In the meantime, during those years, you served on the finance committee, had a huge impact on creating additional transparency for financial machinations that had always been hidden. You made a lot of enemies. You impressed an enormous number of people. You rose up through the Labor Party at one point, were the #2 vote getter in the Labor Party in the country. Now you're out of politics for the time being. Why don't you start by just giving us a picture of Israel in 2020? How does it look to you?
Well, thank you for this introduction. And great to see you, and really happy to be here. We talked about me participating in the conference for such a long time now. So yes, COVID gave us the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for coming for Tel Aviv.
Yeah, it's well, so 2020 is experienced here as a huge, not just a health and economic crisis, but a huge political crisis. When COVID began, Israel was after 3 election rounds, general elections we had in 1 year. The reason we went into elections again and again and again was because Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't get a majority in the first and the second round, so he dragged the country into a third round. Every time we tried in the center left or in what we can call the democratic camp, but not democratic as the name of a party, but the democratic camp as the political camp that wants democracy. We tried to mix, to unite, to create coalitions in order to fight for our democracy. We realized that this is the biggest risk that Israel is going through when the prime minister himself is willing to take away most of the power of parliament and of democracy itself. And in the third round, what happened is that the party that was supposed to be the alternative to Netanyahu decided to join his government and build a unity government. And for the past, since COVID started, and with the excuse of COVID as for the reason they have to unite. However, they built the biggest and most expensive government Israel had ever had, and the crisis was not dealt with. There is a complete disagreement within this government about everything because Netanyahu is under 3 corruption allegations that are being investigated in court. His only worry is to get away from court, and every tool on the way, including hurting our democracy more and more, stealing the power of parliament, of the justice system, of everything is there. So during the biggest crisis that we've known, with 1 million unemployed people, and we're a population of 9 million people in Israel, we're also forced, morally forced, to go to the street and protest because yes, we are fighting for the very democracy of our country.
And the demonstrations this year are the biggest ones since 2011. Is that the case? And tell us a little bit about that. What are people demonstrating for? and
You
you
know, it's
too.
very hard to make because Israel suffers from the crisis in both in terms of health and economically. It's very hard to get people to go to the street and risk themselves in order to protest in these days. However, we felt like we didn't have any other choice. For me, that was actually just the point when I left Parliament in the last election round of that year, and went back to becoming an activist out on the street. And for us, it just felt like we have to do everything that we can in order to make our voice heard. The government used, instead of using transparency and very clear strategy to deal with COVID, the government used surveillance of the Shin Bet, of the security services against citizens. They used more and more police violence during the protests. They basically try to do everything they can in order to use incitement against journalists, against Supreme Court judges. So we went to the street in the beginning every week, and then it became almost a daily thing. And when the lockdown began, people started to protest just a few meters from their homes. While the government tried to sometimes even use the lockdown in order to stop or weaken the protest, people constantly found new and creative ways to do it. Now, it's not ideal. Protesting is an important civil act, but it's not ideal that at this moment we feel like there is no alternative within Parliament, and it's like the entire responsibility is in the hands of citizens and civil society.
So, one of the things you said that the courts are key, and you have gone to court. You've led an effort to call this government to account just in recent weeks, and won a major victory in the Supreme Court. We can't get too bogged down in it, but I want you to quickly summarize what that case was about and where it stands, and because you played such a huge role in it, even as a citizen no longer in the Parliament.
The appeal was about the state budget. So when I was a member of Parliament, my main focus, I got into Parliament as the youngest member, as you said, and I found myself as the only member in the Finance Committee who doesn't really play by the same rules that the more experienced members used to play. And what were those rules? They were about closing deals over people's tax money and moving our tax money into different political interests, rather than actually using them in order to take care of our social services and housing problems and all of that. So I discovered a whole chain of secret corruption budget transfers within the Finance Committee. That became my main obsession within Parliament. I fought to make it transparent, to open the budget, started the Transparency Committee of Parliament. That was my thing. And we managed to get a lot of really big achievements and change the way that things worked. By we, I mean, it was me and thousands of activists, because the whole thing was just an enormous civil action for transparency.
Like a crowdsourced political action, yeah.
Everything. We developed apps in order to open the budget. We got citizens to come and become part of my work within the parliamentary committee. Everything was very much like open source. And that was the way to win it. And now when I'm outside of Parliament, the government tried to take all of our achievements away, basically, but take it a few steps even farther, and just not pass a state budget, which practically means that the biggest corruption ever could just happen right now, actually. Because when we don't have a state budget, it means that there is no parliamentary oversight of the budget. So the government still transfers money, but there is no parliamentary supervision of that. So I had to go to court to appeal. There was no parliamentary action to change that. So we went to court, actually not with very high expectations, because when democracy is under such a big risk, so naturally, there are a lot of appeals to the Supreme Court now by citizens. trying to save different parts of the power of parliament, the power of citizens. So I didn't expect much, but the government came to court with just absolutely no answers, nothing. They even said at some point that it's not Parliament's role to define the priorities of the country, and things that are just in a complete opposition to the idea of democracy. So the Supreme Court basically told them, you can't do this anymore, and you have to legislate, you have to pass a budget. It's a core idea of democracy. I think the biggest challenge, and it's not just an Israeli challenge. I mean, Israel it has very, very, I think, strong citizenship and sense of belonging by citizens who are really willing to fight for our country. But I think that the democratic struggle is now global, and we feel it in many, many different places. And we're just one country that dealing with this struggle, and we're always confronting the same problem. When there is a candidate there is a politician, a leader, who destroys democracy from within by having the power to use parliament in order to weaken parliament itself, it's very hard for the camp that tries to be an alternative to change the game. And what we saw now happening in the US was actually, gave me and gave many others a lot of hope, seeing that the fight against populists and those who don't see democracy with the same importance as others, or as we do, that you can unite, organize, and act very pragmatically, politically, and change the game.
Right. And just to quickly finish the story of the lawsuit, you essentially won in the Supreme Court, and the court has ruled that the government must justify having no budget, and that if they can't do that, they have to have a new election, because without a budget, an election under normal law is called for. If the government can't agree on a budget, typically in your parliamentary system, a new election must be called. Is that roughly an accurate summary?
Yeah, because the state budget, the way that it's been passed here, and actually most countries, the state budget is the most important law that the parliament passes every year. If the budget which summarize the priorities of the new government, if it's not passed, it means the government has to go into elections. And when the government here tried to just dismiss the budget, the idea was that they can postpone elections, which is something you just cannot do in a democracy. So that's the rule. I have to say, elections here are not a very hopeful game as well, because the whole political game became a really big mess. For many, many years, the center-left camp didn't really know how to deal with a prime minister who doesn't have any red lines when it comes to our democracy, and we didn't see the same kind of civil organization structure, infrastructure building, and things like that, like we see today in the States. And I think only in the last maybe year and a half, people finally understand the situation that we're in, and we start organized differently.
Interesting. Yeah, because one of the reasons I wanted to have you here, even though this is ostensibly about the United States, this event predominantly, is there are so many parallels with what Netanyahu and Trump have done, and the approach they take to what they call democracy. So one of the reasons I also wanted to have you here, there is such a parallel issue with the role of technology in the background of all of these machinations, and particularly in the ability of a leader like Trump or Netanyahu to achieve what they do achieve through disinformation, deception, et cetera, using the tools of social media in particular. Now, you rose to your political success in part through your very deft use of social media. And the way we first met was I was an expert on Facebook, and you wanted to learn a little bit about it. But talk to us now about how you see social media functioning in the Israeli political context, and make any analogies you can to the rest of the world, and particularly US.
Well, yeah, I think so. When we discussed the idea of Facebook and social media many times during the last few years, because really My personal perception changed over the years. Seeing and also, well, Facebook and social media changed. It's true that when we organized the protest, social media had core role in giving us power as students who wanted to protest housing prices and became suddenly the leaders of a big protest movement about social services and social justice. So Facebook gave us a lot of power to achieve, to recruit a lot of people and make them leaders of the protest as well. As a parliament member, it also was very powerful in opening up what happens in parliament and getting people to be involved. That was the way, as an opposition member also, the way to achieve power and achieve really big goals. However, I think that the failure of democracies is that a certain gap was developed over the years between the expectation of us as citizens who are used to getting access to every kind of knowledge that we want, to what our democracies or our governments do. It's like technology just developed very, very quickly, but governments and institutions stayed so much behind, so old-fashioned. Instead of adopting technological and the new ways of communicating with the public, of using and opening up government, of using public knowledge in order to get better results.
Like you did with the finance committee, by the way. Yes, go on.
Like, there are so many examples for things that could be done. I think a lot of governments of liberal democracies just stayed behind and created subconsciously in the public a sense that they're not. It's like democracy became less exciting instead of becoming more exciting and developing with the years. And we see with COVID that countries that had much more, that used transparency in dealing with the crisis, that opened up government sessions, that created better ways to communicate with people and use technology in order to communicate with the people and encourage them to and recruit them to for this struggle. They also dealt with COVID much better. I mean, we see Taiwan as a great example of that, with no lockdown, but a lot of technological usage. And we see other examples like that. The governments who were that were less transparent and that used democratic and technological tools less so, were also not as good in dealing with the crisis. And the same thing goes to fighting against populists. So populists have this huge advantage on social network because they just spread so much fiction information and fake news, and it goes very well. Fake news goes very well on social networks these days. So they have this advantage. But what is the advantage of democracies in dealing with that? I think that aspect was just not investigated enough. And there is also inherent problem with the social networks themselves. I think they're also becoming very old-fashioned. Because if people were given the choice, it's true that the algorithms today go to the very basic emotions and needs that we have, and they do it very well, and they know how to get us addicted. But what if we were placed with the choice of what we want to see in our feeds? As an Israeli, and it's not just me, I think many people would really like to see what Palestinians think in their day-to-day lives. We don't have any communication with them as citizens, not at all, like hardly any. What do they think? I want to see them in my social networks feed in order to get the idea of what's happening just a few miles away from me. And I think it goes both ways. So when we're actually asking people if we are, or the future of that, and it's very much interlinked with the future of democracy, to give people much more choice and much more control over what they see, what they watch, the knowledge and the information that they get. The same thing that goes to social media also goes to governments, and governments would not be able to adopt fast enough new technological solutions. We'll also see a lot of failures in their democratic structures and the rise of populists that damage democracy from within.
Well, right now we have such an issue with conspiracy theories in particular, and I'm sure that's as big of an issue in Israel as it is in the United States and the UK and pretty much every democracy right now, where what seemed outlandish and inconceivably ridiculous conspiracy theories in many cases are able to catch hold in large communities and end up reinforcing the power of a demagogue or somebody close to it. And this is true in Hungary, Poland, parts of Italy, Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. This is India very much. So you don't think it's inevitable that we're going to have to be there forever? You see a way out of that. I wish you'd just talk a little more about the way out you see.
I think it's all about, well, to put it very simply, it's about making democracy exciting again. What do populists do? They excite a really big crowd of people by turning into their sometimes worst, but inherent emotions, fears, and anxieties. I think democracy, or democracy 1.0, the one that we know now, just forgot about being exciting. And we have today so many technological opportunities and ways of making it better with people. I mean, if you look at things that happened in different parts around the world, like participatory budget, sharing the budget with, it happens in Colombia, in Medellin in Colombia, and it happens in Paris and in certain parts of Portugal. So when you get part of the democratic process and you get people with the right to really participate in smart ways. And that takes, I'm not talking about direct democracy, I'm talking about truthful education in order to get, they need to get the education and the real facts in order to be able to participate and gain power and not lose their power by participating. And those that adopted these kind of strategies were also more successful. They managed to deal better with crime, to deal better with lack of access to education, many other things that have changed. So I think the future is with creating, Democracy 2.0. One of the things that I'm working now is on starting a fund to support and encourage tech that is pro-democracy, tech that would help us to have much more choice on social networks, that would help us have better access and use in the media to have better and faster access to facts that would give citizens power. I think democracy is related to all the different crises that we have. If we will have better democracy, we will deal better with the climate crisis. If we will have better democracy, we will deal better with war and peace. And when people will get the choice, I believe that the solutions will also be better.
So
and
if
global challenge, and we all have to unite to solve it.
If the success of the sort of negative forces in governments around the world that have succeeded so well with social media is because they've been able to get their followers excited, what you're saying is the other side has to get excited by the same means, using the same platform by honest means, and you believe it's possible. And I think you gave me an interesting example on the phone about the startup nation and the government's role in that, and how government really can play a bigger role in technological progress than most people realize. And just quickly make that point, and then I have one more question for you before we wrap.
Yeah, I think we have we always have this debate if it's the startup nation was made by the private sector, by the government, but actually there are facts here. And in the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s in Israel, the government, which was at the time Rabin's government, Prime Minister Rabin, who was assassinated in 1995 while fighting for peace. So one of the biggest investment of the Rabin government was in tech, in building technological tools, in developing. It was also related to the military. The new tech and cyber units were developed in the military, and that also gave a lot of people access to technological skills. But they put a lot of money in starting the creative technological sphere in Israel, and that was the ground for the startup nation that we're so proud of today. And today it can be developed and it can be self-sustained, but at the very beginning it would not have happened without a lot of government investment. And the same thing goes to most of the technological tools that we're using today around the world, if it's the internet itself, and many other very basic technological tools that we have, there was government investment. And also here with the challenge of democracy, we need governments to invest in this. It's not just in terms of regulation. You know, I'm very careful about regulation when it comes to the internet. I think we have to, some things should be regulated. We don't have choice because some of the companies that work within the internet sphere are just not responsible enough for democracy and for privacy and for their users. So we have to regulate. But actually, it would have been much better if the internet would have remained as this source of freedom for human beings. Yeah. And for that to be achieved, we have to develop greater responsibility within tech corporations in order to create a balance that would not give too much power to politicians, and at the same time, we'll emphasize the fact that those who have to be in power here are the users, are the citizens. But that takes responsibility from all sides of the game.
Yeah, it's true. We obviously need regulation, but your idea of a more proactive, investment-oriented, innovation-oriented approach, even by government itself, is a very positive one, and it dovetails very well with our next session in just a second with Bhaskar Chakravorty and his discussion about what the Biden administration needs to do. So I wanted to ask you about the incredible bravery you've had to show over the last couple of years as you have taken on some really scary forces in Israel. But I'll just tell the audience that happened. But let me end by asking you, do you think you'll go back into government? Is that in the cards for you?
Well, I think it's very important for every politician. You know, I was in politics from the protest movement happened when I was 25 years old, and I'm 10 years now from back then. And I believe that to be a good public servant, you also need to take some shifts and do and learn from other fields. We have in Judaism, there is the idea of Shnat Shmita. It means that every 7 years, it's a very ancient idea. Every 7 years, the farmer basically has to take a break and leave the field and do something else in order to refresh their minds and learn and develop. And I really believe that that you need to take turns and you need to also experience and work from outside of government for some time. So I'm very happy for this experience that I'm going through now. And the idea, I'm today worried about some of the global challenges that we have and understand that they are influencing Israel in many, many different ways. And we can influence back. So my focus is on finding the path into democracy 2.0 and what it's supposed to be. And collaborate with many good friends around the world on solving or finding solutions for this challenge, which I believe will influence my country here and will influence the world as a whole. And I think I'm happy for the opportunity to dedicate some time to this. And in the future, the fire you have in your body about continuing to influence and make a change is there. So in the future, politics will of course be considered as well.
Well, as someone who's known you now for about 8 years and has seen some of the things you've done in the meantime, I can tell this audience, you are going to be hearing more from this person. So Stav, thank you so much for being here. And we'll check back in with you virtually or in person in the future. And thank you for all that you do. Thanks so much.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.